I've been doing a lot of Storytime videos about work events within the last few years, but this time I'm gonna kick it old school back to 2005 or so. Back when I was an insecure 17-year-old in high school. I'd do a picture this word montage, but honestly, I don't remember a lot of the zeitgeist because I wasn't living in the moment at the time. Hell, I could barely remember where I was staffed at work most days, so the fact that I can remember a story that took place over 20 odd years ago is an outright miracle. But anyway, moving on. A few things I need to clarify before I begin. My ex in this story identifies as female, but at the time I was dating her, she was living and presenting as male, with no hint to her true identity. There are several key events of this story that rely on the assumption that she was male in order to make sense. So for grammar's sake, I will refer to her as he for the pre-transition parts of the story, and she for the current story elements. Both her dead name and her current name in this story are made up to protect her anonymity. I only say this because I know it's generally not proper to refer to transgender people by past pronouns, even when telling pre-transition stories about them. But things might get confusing for normies if I try to explain that my ex-girlfriend introduced me to a girl to date because I'd never been with a girl before, and stuff like that. Remember, I've identified as queer before most of the pronoun police were even born, so I know how to be respectful of people in my own community. But as the title of this video suggests, this story isn't so much about my ex-girlfriend, but her mother, who arguably had more of an impact on my life. So without further ado, flashback to my last couple of years in high school, between 2005 and 2006. Like most teenagers, I struggled with mental health issues on top of everything else in my awkward metamorphosis from adolescence to adulthood, and it wasn't a good time. Looking back, I don't think I was that different from anyone else, but at the time I felt very alone. Partially from the circumstances of my upbringing, and partially from that youthful pretentiousness teenagers tend to go through, where they get it in their heads that they're better or smarter than anyone else. Needless to say, this made it difficult to relate to others, especially when dating was involved. When it came to romantic relationships, I reacted one of two ways. I either fell hard almost to the point of one-nightitis, or I settled for someone who liked me because I didn't want them to feel rejected and I just figured I would learn to love them later. Even still, all of my romantic relationships evolved out of some semblance of friendship, and my relationship with Roderick was no different. I remember meeting Roderick sometime when I was hung up on the guy who was my high school love, which is probably a story in and of itself, but after that went bust, I ended up hanging out with Roderick more often. Sometimes I'd go chill at his place with the older of my two younger brothers, but after a point I'd be hanging out with Roderick more by myself, or rather, with Roderick and his mother, Tracy. At first, Tracy seemed like a sweet lady, and for the most part she was. I felt very welcomed and comfortable in her home. I remember her making me dinner on multiple occasions, bringing me CDs of my favorite songs for my birthday, gifting me handmade items that I still own to this day. I even remember my mom meeting Roderick at some point and noting that he was the only one who would actually introduce himself to her, rather than previous idiots who would just wait outside my door until I came out. What's more is that Roderick and Tracy were in the same income bracket as my family, which made it easier to get comfortable around them because I didn't constantly feel like I had to present outside of my social class to be accepted like I did around middle class friends. Looking back though, I think that some of her hospitality bordered on love bombing. Either way, I enjoyed their company, especially when things got difficult at my own house. But when Roderick started expressing more overt interest in me, things got a little more complex. On Halloween of 2005, Roderick and I took my youngest siblings trick-or-treating. I don't remember our costumes, but I recall that we all had a pretty good time and scored a decent haul of candy. We returned to my house at the end of the outing, letting my siblings go inside first so Roderick and I could have a few minutes alone. As I had feared, he politely but firmly attempted to make a move on me, insisting I allow him to at least kiss me on the cheek. I was reluctant, but I relented and went inside and tried to put the incident out of my mind. I didn't talk about it with Roderick or anyone else, but a short time later I was back at his place and the tension started to rise again. I was confused about the kiss he demanded back on Halloween night, so I asked, "What are we?" in regard to relationship status. We talked briefly and, from there, we decided to be a couple. We ended up making out, and I enjoyed the sensations at the time, but I also felt that sense of guilt I always feel whenever I engaged in normal teenage exploration. You see, I was raised with a conservative Christian upbringing, and while it wasn't as strict as, like, the Duggars or something, I was brought up to believe that certain things were wrong, and I felt like I didn't have a lot of first-hand guidance or advice that I was able to understand as far as things like sex and feelings were concerned. While I had some semblance of skepticism, the concept of sin still weighed heavily on me. When I got home later, I remember drinking nearly half a bottle of cough syrup in an attempt to numb the confusion I was feeling. You'd think that growing up in poverty, I'd have access to some real drugs. But I didn't, so I basically had to make do with whatever I could find in my mom's medicine cabinet at the time. It did the trick, but the next day at school, I had one of the worst hangovers I've had to date. I downed Robitussin again the next time I went over to his place, and even though I told him about it and was clearly inebriated, he made out with me anyway. I would often try to get out of going, but sometimes things were so difficult for me at home that I felt like I needed a safe place to escape. So I would try to only go over there when Tracy was there, but she would encourage us experimenting under the age-old adage of, teens are gonna do it anyway, they might as well do it somewhere safe, and left us to our devices. As our relationship progressed, Roderick became insistent that he be allowed to touch me in areas I was neither familiar nor comfortable with. And although I was able to stop most serious offenses, he was pushy to the point where I felt pressured to allow him some leeway. The guilt, resentment, and OTC substance use continued. Ironically, Tracy herself was a victim of childhood sexual abuse, and I was secretly angry at her for her lack of supervision and devil-may-care attitude towards teenage sexuality. On a similar note, it was Tracy who gave me my first alcoholic drink when I was 17, a champagne punch during a private celebration of the winter holidays. Once again citing her fatalistic parenting philosophy, she didn't really let me refuse, and at that point I just wanted to mentally escape, so I drank it. Being the lightweight that I am, I got instantly tipsy, but for whatever reason Roderick only wanted to play Yu-Gi-Oh cards that day, so I avoided something that could have been much more traumatic. Well, I'd be a damn liar if I tried to claim I never smoked or drank with people under 21 when I was well above that age myself. I feel like it's one thing to crack open a cold one with your 19-year-old work bro, and another to get someone else's literal child drunk and leave them alone with the kid you encouraged to be sexually adventurous. And for what it's worth, I did tell my mom about some of these things just to get them off my chest. I didn't tell her that they were a result of coercion because I knew she wouldn't do anything about it. Her reaction of disgust and disappointment just made me feel worse. In retrospect, I guess I was stupid, but I didn't know how to handle the situation at the time. I think bottling these things up just made me feel more guilty and afraid of being found out. But I probably came off as defiant, and for that, I apologize. I just really wanted someone's help, but no one ever stood up for me. In fact, I think it was because of the awkward distance between me and my own mother that I felt more comfortable with Tracy. But even then, she still had some hot takes that I didn't know how to feel about. Besides the constant info dumping about her own often traumatic life experiences, Tracy was what I'd consider to be a social justice warrior before SJWs were a thing, and she only got worse over the years. First of all, Tracy was a practicing pagan. Now back then, pretty much every goth or queer girl self-identified as pagan as a form of rebelling against Christianity, but she apparently took that stuff seriously. I did my best to respect it, but as I stated earlier, I was still heavily influenced by the stigma of the religion I was raised in, and I didn't feel comfortable engaging in certain practices or ideologies that Tracy exposed me to. Second, Tracy was a radical feminist, and much of her man-hating rhetoric influenced Roderick to think that he had to think and act a certain way simply because he was assigned male at birth. He would often parrot these takes to me, and I never understood why he believed them. Despite being coercive at times, he was never outright rapey like Tracy would have him believe all men were programmed to be. And lastly, most perplexingly, I distinctly remember Tracy giving me this long conversation, apropos of nothing, about how bisexuality wasn't real and being attracted to someone was a choice, which hurt me because I was a closeted bisexual myself. And it's people like Tracy and Roderick that make me want to hide in the closet forever. But that wasn't always the case. As the weeks dragged on, I basically went numb in the relationship. And finally Roderick took the hint that I wasn't interested, and we ended it on somewhat mutual terms. We still hung out a bit at school, but at that point I couldn't understand why I wasn't happy or comfortable being with guys in relationships, and I wondered if I was actually gay. I had no experience with women as relationship partners at that point, so I started looking for potential girlfriends in my area on MySpace to see if something would click. Being queer in the late 2000s was not as widely accepted back then as it is now. And even still, we have a ways to go, so most of my friends and acquaintances didn't even know. Unfortunately, I made the mistake of telling Roderick about it, and one day he told me he knew a girl who was interested in possibly being my girlfriend. Let's call her Jeanette, and that he could arrange for us to meet at his place. If by chance the Jeanette in question is watching this, I apologize for coming off like a weird little lesbian cringelord in my teenage years. I remember not feeling very pretty that day, which was shaking my already fragile confidence, but nevertheless, I was excited. I remember meeting Jeanette and thinking she was so pretty, but I felt somewhat intimidated by her bold nature and the fact that she had far more worldly experience than me. Nevertheless, she seemed to like me well enough, and I even got to kiss her a couple of times, with Roderick playing matchmaker, so to speak. In my dull-ass teenage mind, she was already my girlfriend. Until Tracy came home and started talking to her. She had previously dated Roderick herself, which I knew about previously and was indifferent to. So Tracy was well acquainted with her already, and they were just catching up. And that's when I learned about Jeanette's steady boyfriend, or rather, fiancé. I felt my heart sink and I wanted to turn around and run home. But I swallowed my pride and stayed, even though the day just got worse from there. I went home that night and spent some time being emo about the situation, struggling with my feelings of rejection among the Christian shame of wondering if a relationship with a woman could ever feel legitimate if we could never marry, as same-sex marriages would not be legal for another decade at that point. I had friended her on MySpace, and her posts implied that she and her man were taking a break or otherwise having trouble in paradise, or something to that effect that I interpreted. And my hormonal brain got to thinking that I could somehow prove that I was the better option, like I could win her over somehow. And the following weekend, I was given that opportunity when I was invited to go to the mall with her and Roderick. The three of us had a pretty good time at the mall for what it was worth. I remember at one point we hit up Spencer's and went into the back area. You know the one. Jeanette wanted to buy a personal massager, as it were, and she had the money for it but was too embarrassed to buy it outright. Well, that right there was teenage Sarah Elaine's time to shine. I offered to take the cash she handed me and make the purchase at the register myself. And even though she and Roderick were right there as I completed the transaction, it was like I was buying it for her. I wouldn't call it my proudest moment, but it's far from the worst thing I've ever done to impress a romantic interest. The whole day I was forcing myself into high energy, but by the end of it, I knew I couldn't do that forever. So at the end of the day when Jeanette went home, I confronted Roderick, wondering if he knew beforehand that Jeanette was in a serious relationship, and if he had told her what the plan for meeting me was supposed to be. He confessed that he was still attracted to both of us and was using the arrangement as an excuse to have both of us around again. I told him to go to hell and that I never wanted to see either of them ever again, though I did end up still being friends with Jeanette. And at the time of recording this, she's currently the only person from high school that I still have any connection with. Fast forward to 2012 or so, when I was about 24 years old. I already had my first marriage and 3 kids under my belt. While I wasn't as depressed as I was as a teenager, I was still struggling to find my place in the world. At some point, Roderick and Tracy reconnected with me through Facebook, and I ended up talking with the former on the phone. Roderick revealed that he was transitioning to female and would henceforth be known as Lucy. Although initially I had my doubts, assuming that Tracy had instilled internalized misandry into my ex, but then I realized that it was possible that all of Lucy's past aggression was an attempt to present as how a male might be expected to act and a cover for gender dysphoria, and then a lot of things made sense. While it was not okay for Lucy to do the things she did when we were teenagers, I felt like I understood her better, and we forgave each other for past transgressions. Tracy even messaged me after the phone call and asked for my feedback on the situation, and suggested that we all maintain our friendship. After that, I was on pretty good terms with Lucy. We mostly just chatted about nerd stuff, like games and cartoons. She didn't post on Facebook a whole lot. Tracy, however, was a different story. She was an outspoken, die-hard liberal and made sure everyone knew it. In between posts about how her old friends and family didn't want to communicate with her. Despite insisting over and over that she's the most tolerant person in the world, I don't think I've ever met anyone so easily and unironically offended over every socio-political talking point under the sun. And this is considering that I was active on Tumblr in the early 20-teens. Nevertheless, I did my best to tolerate her radicalism because she was the mom of my friend, and she claimed to care for my well-being, even going as far as to say I was basically family to her. Though realistically, I think she was low-key trying to get me back in a relationship with Lucy, even though both Lucy and I were seeing other people at the time. My own relationship wasn't going well for a number of reasons, but that's a whole other rabbit hole to fall down. Still, I remember Tracy being a bit opportunistic at times, suggesting at some point I ought to live with her and Lucy, an idea I certainly was not comfortable with, to say the least. But anyway, after a point, I muted Tracy's Facebook because I couldn't take any more of her soapboxing. At the time, I was a member of the LDS Church, and though I was and still consider myself to be a socio-political moderate, I did not appreciate the fact that she continued to openly attack certain viewpoints I held at the time, especially when she seemed to hold a cognitive dissonance to the fact that I openly believed in them. Of course, from time to time she would comment her hot takes on my posts and piss off my friends and family, then cry in my DMs as though she was just trying to be helpful to me and everyone was against her. I never called her out on what I really thought of her opinions, since it was easier just to ignore her or placate her with a neutral response. But eventually I just unfriended her. But I had forgotten that she had friended me on 2 different accounts, and all it took was me making one innocuous post for everything to come to a head. On April 20th, 2016, I shared a Rob Zombie meme that referenced the lyrics to his song Dragula, which features the line, "Dig through the ditches and burn through the witches." Even in the song's context, it's not an attack on paganism, but Tracy took it as one with a comment that simply said, "I'm pagan, this offends me." At first I thought she was being facetious, so I asked for clarity and pointed out that as a Christian, I had equal reason to be put off by Rob Zombie's music and wasn't. Tracy didn't elaborate on why my post bothered her. She simply repeated that she found it offensive, as though that was the be-all and end-all of arguments. Just then, my female best friend, not Lucy, came in with more balls than I had and told Tracy to get over herself. I liked my bestie's comment, which Tracy saw, and Tracy immediately began her self-flagellating victimization rather than just clarifying rationally that she felt it painted pagans in a bad light, and promptly announced that she would be unfriending me for daring to agree with my BFF. Because apparently, someone who has repeatedly gone on diatribes about how wrong it is to disown your own family members for being queer finds nothing wrong with cutting them off for a difference in opinion. Once Tracy had made good on her threat, I responded with a comment pointing to Tracy saying, "Wait, I'm confused. This woman posts ad nauseum stuff that's anti-Christian, overly liberal, or otherwise a direct attack on something I personally believe in. But one offhanded reference in a song triggers her. Okay." Lucy messaged me later, trying to remain neutral, but she insisted that what I said was unnecessary, and that I should have just said something if I was bothered by Tracy's social justice blathering. In hindsight, Lucy had a point, but at the time I didn't agree with the idea of censoring someone on their own personal Facebook page, and I doubted Tracy would have kowtowed if the shoe was on the other foot. At the time, I was disappointed that I had unintentionally hurt my friend's feelings, and I was convinced that I had done wrong by her and her mother. Now that I look back on this whole mess, I'm actually kind of angry because no, I didn't do anything wrong. A 50-year-old woman acted like a petulant child over a perceived wrong thing, and I didn't so much as defend myself, to say nothing of the actual real-world harm she and her offspring did to me before I had reached any kind of age of consent. Lucy ended up unfriending me herself a few days later, though she maintained sporadic contact with me on other platforms up until about 2019 or so. When I initially reflected on this story, I was actually triggered. It brought to light a lot of repressed feelings that made me realize my teenage experience with Lucy and Tracy might have been the catalyst to a series of bad life choices and trauma responses. What Lucy did to me in adolescence was not okay, even if she was going through something herself, and I still feel like Tracy had the obligation to protect me and failed. Still, I forgave her a long time ago, and now I'm learning to forgive myself for not standing up to them, either as a teen or as a 20-something. It would still be years before I learned how to set hard boundaries to stop putting up with unnecessary crap, but that's a story for another time.